All right, hey gang. Get my slideshow up. There we go. Whoops. All right, welcome to week 5 of the class. So this week, we're going to cover chapters 11 and 12. Next week, we'll do 13 and 14, and that officially ends our class. So we're in the home stretch here. There's some important due dates down at the bottom of this slide. So notice that quiz 4 will be open August 20th to 24th. And then I like to leave you a few days to redo that quiz if you want. So the official, all the work and all the grading won't be done for a few days after that. Check the due dates on my EMCC and check your email things. I'll try to update you, but understand that even though this is a 6-week course, it's probably going to drag on for another week or so beyond that. Just you could be done after 6 weeks, but I'm trying to give you a little extra time to get things done if you want to. So in this video, and this will probably have to come in 2 parts, we're going to start talking about chapter 11, which covers inflation and unemployment. So inflation and unemployment are the 2 main problems that government economists have to worry about. The 2 big things that cause problems for people in the economy are inflation and unemployment. Inflation, as you probably know, just refers to rising prices overall. So the prices of most things tend to rise a little bit, but if they rise rapidly, that really causes problems for people. It basically devalues any money that you have, makes your money worth less because you can buy less for it. So inflation is a problem. It usually occurs during periods of rapid economic growth. So it occurs during boom times in the economy. Unemployment, obviously, is when people who can't work or people who want to work can't find work, or people lose their jobs. So when the unemployment rate increases, obviously that's a problem for those people who lose their jobs, or for people who are looking for jobs and can't find one. And this usually happens during periods of recession. So right off the bat, there's an important difference. Inflation usually happens during good economic times when it's growing. Unemployment usually increases during times when the economy is going downhill, entering a recession or in a recession. So these 2 don't really normally tend to happen at the same time. For this reason, there is an inverse relationship known as the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve just shows this inverse relationship or trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So the Phillips curve is very simple, looks kind of like this. There are a couple of different pictures in your book. And you don't even have to worry about the curvature here. The important part for us is just the negative slope, which tells you that as the inflation rate goes up, most of the time the unemployment rate is going to go down and vice versa. When inflation goes down, unemployment goes up. This was developed by a guy named Phillips. It was thought to be true, and evidence showed it to be true or supported it throughout much of the 1960s, and people sort of started to accept it as just settled law in economics. Then some weird exceptions occurred in the 70s and 80s. Your book does a really good job of explaining these. I'm not going to go through them, just trying to paint the big picture here, but be sure and read that. You'll see that some exceptions occurred in the 70s and 80s where we had things like high inflation and a high unemployment rate. That's the worst case scenario for an economy. But I would argue, and I think the book supports this, that those were largely due to outside shocks, outside factors like the OPEC oil embargo, something like that. So, in those cases, you might see an exception, but I think it's still generally true that most of the time there is this inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Part of what's important for us in these last few chapters, we're going to start talking about how the government manages the economy through fiscal and monetary policy. And so this relationship leads to some trade-offs sometimes, meaning sometimes if we're in a recession, the government has things that they can do that will help us bring out of the recession and help lower the unemployment rate. The fear is if they do a little too much of it, it might cause inflation. So then they've solved one problem and created another. Similarly, if we're in a boom period, there are things the government can do to cool the economy down and reduce the inflation rate. The fear is they might increase the unemployment rate. So this is an important part of what government economists worry about and talk about and debate all the time. Okay, so more recently, since we've kind of seen these exceptions to the Phillips curve, they're starting to talk about the economy as working in phases. While I think still generally a lot of times the Phillips curve relationship is true, a lot of times what you see are kind of these circular phases. So to get this kind of diagram, what they're doing is just plotting both the inflation rate and the unemployment rate at different points through time. So this shows you three phases. The Phillips phase we've already kind of covered. That's where you have rising inflation and falling unemployment, or it could be vice versa, but that's known as a Phillips phase. So when the relationship kind of supports that notion of the Phillips curve, we now call it a Phillips phase. Then there's a stagflation phase. Sometimes this is possible. In this example, inflation has been driven up really high. Then it starts to cause other problems in the economy. The economy slows down, and you see unemployment increasing. So that's what I said was the worst case scenario. Stagflation means the economy is stagnating. It's not growing. We're seeing unemployment, but we're still seeing inflation. So we've got both of our big problems going on at the same time. And then we can also enter a recovery phase when the economy starts to come out of a recession and recover. And in this case, both inflation and unemployment fall. So that's an example. And we're going to actually talk about each of those three phases a little bit more now and relate it back to our model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So in the Phillips phase, in the Phillips phase, here you have your Phillips curve on the right, but in panel A, we have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And in this case, the economic growth is being caused by aggregate demand increasing. That means businesses and people are feeling good about the future. They're getting more money, so they're spending more money, and that tends to push the price level up. So that's how you get inflation, is people are spending more and more money. A lot of times they're trying to buy things up faster than the economy can even produce them, so that tends to push prices up. So that's what's going on in the Phillips phase. At some point, though, those rising prices begin to cause problems for businesses because they're asked to pay out higher wages. They're having to pay more for their inputs and things like that. So those increasing costs of production will cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to decrease. So you see on this graph, panel A, short-run aggregate supply is shifting to the left. So our equilibrium is going from 0.3 to 0.4. So as we move back to the left there, the price level is going up further, so you still get inflation, and real GDP is decreasing, which means the economy is shrinking, workers are losing their jobs, unemployment is rising. So that's what's going on in the aggregate supply and demand market. That's shown in panel B by the movement from 3 to 4, where you see a little bit of inflation along with increasing unemployment. Then I think in this scenario that the book describes, and what's mostly been true in the last few decades, is when we get into a recession like that, there are things that the government can do to help us get out. So TARP and some of those programs you saw after the Great Recession of 2008 basically involved the government either spending its own money or somehow putting money in the hands of people in order to get more spending to occur and increase aggregate demand. So that, when the government does that kind of thing, provides economic stimulus, as they call it, it increases aggregate demand. So we move this way, so we're moving from 0.4 to 0.5. So you might see a little bit of inflation there, although less than you had before, perhaps, and increasing unemployment. So even though it looks like inflation is going down, keep in mind it's the inflation rate. So there might still be some inflation, but instead of 5% inflation, if we only have 1 or 2%, that's much better. So that's what's happening in the recovery phase. So that's all three of those kind of explained in terms of supply and demand. And I think I'm going to end this video here because I'm going to sort of change the subject and cover one more topic in part 2 of this video. So thanks.